Welcome back, my friend. Before tonight's story begins, take a quiet moment for yourself. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let tonight's quiet journey begin. There is a battleship in Pearl Harbor that exploded in seconds, but never truly left that morning. It still lies beneath the water. It still holds more than 1,000 men inside. And stranger still, more than 80 years later, it still leaks oil, as if the ship itself is still breathing in the dark. This is not only the story of the attack on Pearl Harbor, it is the story of a battleship that became a mass grave, became a reef, and became a memory that never fully sank. Tonight, we go beneath the surface to visit the ship that time has never fully released. But before the fire, before the explosion tore through USS Arizona, there was an ordinary Sunday morning. Sailors were still asleep below deck. Coffee was waiting. The harbor water was still calm, and no one aboard knew that in only a few minutes, their ship would become a tomb beneath the sea. Before the first bomb, long before the first aircraft appeared above the harbor, before sirens cut through the Hawaiian morning, before explosions rolled across the water and changed the 20th century, there was a quieter world inside Pearl Harbor. It was still dark when the first men aboard the battleship USS Arizona stirred in their bunks. The ship rested along Battleship Row, heavy and still, moored beside other great warships whose steel hulls rose out of the water like sleeping fortresses in the darkness before dawn. Their outlines were little more than shadows. Masts and guns disappeared into the night sky. The harbor water moved softly against the hull. Nothing in that motion suggested violence. If you had stood on deck in those early hours of December 7th, 1941, you might have noticed only ordinary things: the faint salt in the air, the smell of oil and machinery lingering in the ship, a distant light along the shore, the muted sounds of men beginning another routine Sunday. Some sailors were already awake, moving through passageways under dim electric lights. Some prepared for morning duties. Others remained asleep in narrow bunks, unaware they were living the final quiet moments of their lives. That was one of the strange things about history's most violent mornings. They often begin looking perfectly ordinary. The men aboard Arizona had their habits, letters half written, coffee expected, breakfast routines, inspections, religious services planned later in the day. Sunday carried its own slower rhythm, even on a warship. And though the Pacific had grown tense in those years, though diplomatic signals had darkened and rumors of conflict moved through military circles, daily life often softens the sense of approaching catastrophe. People continue with routine. They polish brass. They make jokes. They postpone worry until tomorrow. Even aboard a battleship built for war, the Arizona herself had already lived a long life before becoming a tomb. Commissioned in 1916, she belonged to an earlier generation of naval power, when nations believed immense guns and armored hulls could decide the fate of empires. She had crossed oceans, carried crews through peacetime exercises, been modernized, waited, prepared for a war not yet formally declared. Her steel seemed permanent. Her presence in the harbor seemed stable. There is something haunting later in realizing how solid things can appear only hours before destruction. A ship can seem eternal. A morning can seem ordinary, and both can vanish before noon. In the harbor that morning, lights gradually appeared. The sky began its slow change. Black softened into deep blue, then gray. The first hint of Hawaiian dawn touched the water. The harbor began waking. Across Battleship Row, other ships held their own sleeping populations. USS West Virginia, USS Oklahoma, USS California, steel giants at anchor, arranged with such calm order that the scene might have seemed almost ceremonial. Yet beneath that calm, unknown to nearly everyone below, events were already moving toward them over open ocean. Far north of Oahu, a Japanese strike force had launched aircraft, bombers, torpedo planes, fighters. They were already in the air, while sailors in Pearl Harbor shaved, dressed, or slept. The distance between peace and attack in that moment was measured only by time, and very little of it remained. But aboard Arizona, none of this had yet broken the surface of awareness. There is something deeply human in imagining those unseen minutes. A sailor folding a letter home, another adjusting a uniform collar, someone leaning briefly against a rail, watching morning light spread over the harbor, perhaps noticing how still the water seemed, perhaps thinking of nothing at all. History rarely warns the people standing inside it. It simply arrives, and when it does, the ordinary details become sacred in memory. The untouched breakfast, the unspoken sentence, the unfinished note, the bed left unmade. These small remnants survive in ways larger events sometimes do not, because catastrophe often freezes attention around what existed immediately before. The last peaceful minute, the final unnoticed breath, the world just before it changed. On Arizona, the crew numbered more than 1,500. Most could not have imagined that within hours, the ship would be wrecked, burning, and sinking into the harbor floor. That more than 1,000 of them would never leave, that the vessel itself would remain there decades later beneath a white memorial, that visitors would come from around the world to stand over their graves. That oil would still rise slowly from the hull generations later. No one aboard could know any of this, and perhaps that ignorance is part of what makes the moment so moving. The dead, before becoming the dead, were simply people living a mourning. There was no dramatic music, no warning spoken by history, only routine, only harbor light, only a warship resting in quiet water. Even the guns, those enormous naval guns that symbolized power, sat motionless, cold, silent, unused. Soon they would be surrounded by fire, but not yet. And in late night history, perhaps it is worth lingering here, not at the explosion, not yet, but in the strange tenderness before violence. Because once the first bomb falls, everything changes. But before that first bomb, there was still a harbor, still a Sunday, still men laughing somewhere below deck, still the illusion shared by thousands that tomorrow would resemble today. And that illusion can be one of history's most fragile things. As dawn widened over Pearl Harbor, The water reflected the growing light. The ships cast longer shapes. Voices rose. Movement increased. Morning fully arrived, and somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen, unheard, moving steadily closer, the first wave approached. At 7:55 in the morning, the silence ended. It did not end gradually, it was torn apart. For the men aboard USS Arizona, the first awareness that something was wrong did not arrive as a clear understanding. It arrived as fragments, a distant engine, an unfamiliar sound overhead, a sudden movement of aircraft where none should have been, then explosions. At first, some did not understand what they were hearing. Training exercise, perhaps. An accident, a routine alert, mistaken for urgency. Human beings often hesitate in the first seconds of disaster because the mind resists believing ordinary life has already ended. But Pearl Harbor gave little time for disbelief. Japanese aircraft descended over the harbor in coordinated waves, low enough for men below to see markings on wings. The rising sun, red against pale metal. There are moments in history when recognition comes all at once. This was one of them. This was not a drill. This was war. The first bombs fell across the harbor almost immediately. Anti-craft fire began from ships and shore batteries, but confusion moved faster than response. Men ran toward battle stations. Some ran half-dressed, some barefoot, some carrying ammunition, some still trying to understand where the attack was coming from. Sirens screamed, orders were shouted, smoke began rising over Battleship Row, and the peaceful geometry of the harbor dissolved into movement, fire, and shock. From Arizona's deck, sailors could see aircraft diving toward neighboring ships, torpedo planes skimming low over water, bombers releasing payloads, machine gun fire cutting across exposed decks. The harbor that had seemed so still at dawn had become violent in every direction, and still, much of what was happening unfolded faster than human thought could keep pace. That is one of the strange truths of aerial attack. It compresses time. Seconds feel incomplete. Events overlap before they can be processed. Men act before understanding. History accelerates. On nearby USS Oklahoma, torpedo strikes came quickly. On USS West Virginia, damage mounted almost at once. Across the harbor, explosions echoed off water and steel. But aboard Arizona, the deadliest moment had not yet arrived. For a few minutes, there was still motion, still organized resistance, still the possibility, however fragile, that the ship might survive the attack. Crew members moved ammunition, attempted to man anti-aircraft positions, prepared guns. Some fired, some tried, some died, reaching stations they never reached. And perhaps this is what late-night history allows us to notice. Not only destruction, but effort, the human instinct to move toward duty even while danger closes, even in chaos, even when there is almost no chance. Because on warships, training becomes reflex, and reflex becomes action. One sailor later recalled the sky seeming full of planes. Another described the noise as beyond ordinary hearing, not sound, but pressure, a force in the air itself. And beneath it all, smoke, smoke spreading low, smoke rising high, smoke turning clear Hawaiian morning into something darker. Meanwhile, some men still believed the attack might pass quickly, that the worst might already be happening elsewhere, that Arizona, though threatened, might endure. There is often a final illusion before catastrophe reaches its center. This was theirs. At approximately 8 o'clock, bombs continued falling. Near misses through columns of water against hulls. Fragments tore through exposed positions. Men were wounded before they could even fully join the fight, and still the attack pressed inward. There is something almost impossible, years later, in trying to imagine how rapidly an ordinary Sunday became this. Minutes earlier, coffee, routine, dawn, now fire, aircraft, death, moving overhead. And yet, even amid terror, people observed details. The angle of diving bombers, the scream of engines, the shockwave of impacts, the color of smoke. Memory often records catastrophe through particulars, not abstractions. A sound, a flash, a shape in the sky. At 7:55, Pearl Harbor entered history. But for those inside it, history was not a concept. It was immediate survival. It was whether to reach a gun, whether to help a wounded shipmate, whether to run below deck or remain topside, whether the next bomb was already falling toward you. And somewhere amid this chaos, there remained a cruel fact few understood. The strike that would destroy Arizona had not yet landed. What they were experiencing, terrible as it was still only the approach. The center of disaster was still descending from the sky. In late night reflection, this moment carries its own peculiar weight, because it is the narrow passage between ignorance and irreversible loss. The moment people know they are under attack, but do not yet know what the attack will take from them. And that may be one of the loneliest places in history, to stand in danger before knowing its full size. At 7:55, men aboard Arizona fought confusion. At 7:57, they fought fire and falling bombs. At 7:59, some may still have believed survival possible. And then, overhead, one aircraft approached on a line that would alter everything. One bomb, one descending arc, one impact still seconds away. And in those final seconds, before the magazine explosion, the ship was still alive. The magazine explosion. There are moments in history so violent, they seem to divide time itself. Before and after for USS Arizona, that dividing moment came just after 8 o'clock in the morning. The attack had already torn through the harbor. Bombs had fallen. Guns had begun answering. Smoke drifted across Battleship Row. Men moved through confusion, heat, and noise, believing perhaps that survival still depended on effort. Then one aircraft came in high above the ship, a Japanese bomber. Its path, among countless movements in the sky that morning, did not seem at first to belong to destiny. And yet, history sometimes hides inside a single descending object. The bomb fell. Accounts differ in small details, as they often do in catastrophe, but the larger reality remains. The armor-piercing bomb struck near the forward section of the ship. It penetrated, passed into the interior, and reached the area near Arizona's forward magazines, where immense quantities of powder and ammunition were stored. Then, Osog, detonation. What followed happened so fast, Witnesses often struggled to describe it. Some said the ship seemed to lift. Some described a blinding flash. Some remembered a wall of flame. Others recalled only noise so enormous it ceased sounding like sound. The explosion tore through the battleship with such force that much of the forward section was destroyed almost instantly. Steel ruptured, decks shattered, turrets were thrown out of alignment. Fire erupted upward, and thousands of tons of ship seemed, for one impossible moment, consumed in a single burst of violence. It has often been said the explosion killed more than 1,000 men in moments. That phrase is accurate, but also strangely too small, because numbers do not capture what it means for lives to vanish inside one overwhelming flash. Many sailors died without time even to react. Some where they stood, some while moving toward stations, some in compartments below, some in sleepwear, some perhaps never fully understood what happened. Death came faster than thought. There is something terrible and strangely tender in that possibility that some were spared fear by the speed of destruction. Witnesses on nearby ships saw fire rise hundreds of feet into the air, a great orange-black column, burning oil, debris, fragments of steel, and men. The harbor itself seemed to recoil, even amid an attack already filled with explosions. This was something different, something larger, something final. The destruction of Arizona did not resemble ordinary battle damage. It resembled the sudden breaking open of a world. One sailor elsewhere in the harbor later said it looked as though the entire ship had exploded at once, and perhaps from outside it had, but inside, what happened was a chain, pressure, flame, shock, moving through compartments. Heat so intense, it made survival impossible in places almost instantly. And then fire, so much fire. The great guns that had sat silent at dawn now stood amid ruin. The proud structure of the battleship collapsed inward toward becoming wreck. And all this took less time than many conversations. History sometimes spends years approaching a moment it delivers in seconds. This was one of those seconds. In late-night reflection, it is difficult not to linger on the men themselves, because they were not abstractions inside a military loss. They were individuals, interrupted, a thought unfinished, a movement incomplete, a letter never mailed, lives divided by a blast no one aboard could stop. There is a reason Arizona became more than a sunken ship. It became symbol because destruction that was so immediate, so concentrated, so absolute, it seemed to contain the shock of the entire attack. Even today, when people remember Pearl Harbor, many imagine first the burning Arizona. The ship became memory's center, but immediately after the explosion, there was no symbolism, only survival among the living. Some men, burned or wounded, escaped wreckage. Some leapt into oil-covered water. Some pulled others clear. Some kept fighting fires, even after witnessing something nearly beyond comprehension. Human action persisted, even inside devastation. And perhaps that too matters, because history remembers explosions, but often forgets those who moved through their aftermath. Around the wreck, debris fell back into harbor water. Burning fuel spread. Smoke thickened. The attack continued. And this is another terrible truth. Even the destruction of Arizona did not stop the mourning. War moved on. Aircraft still attacked elsewhere. Other ships still suffered. Other men still died. History does not pause for its own tragedies. It carries them while continuing forward. But for Arizona, the essential fate of the ship had already been decided. She was mortally broken, burning, sinking, becoming, in real time, the grave she would remain. More than 1,000 sailors and Marines would be lost aboard her. Most would never be recovered. Most would remain where the explosion took them, inside the hull, inside history, inside the harbor floor. And perhaps what makes this moment feel almost unbearable, even decades later, is how thin the boundary had been. Minutes earlier, morning routine. At 7:55, attack. Just after 8 o'clock, a bomb. Then a ship transformed into ruin. So much changed in so little time. The human mind resists scales like that, which may be why we return to these moments. To understand what cannot be fully understood. To sit beside what remains difficult. To listen in some quiet way to the silence after impact. Because after the magazine explosion, after the fireball, after the shattered steel, after the dead settled where they had fallen, there remained one long question hanging over burning water. How could so much have ended so fast? When the fire would not go out. After the explosion, there was no clear boundary between ship and fire. The two had become one. What remained of USS Arizona burned with a violence that did not end in minutes or even hours. The great detonation had passed, but its aftermath kept unfolding. Flames moved through wreckage. Fuel burned across water. Smoke rose in dark columns over the harbor, and men who had survived the explosion now faced something slower, but no less terrible. Enduring fire. There is sometimes a mistaken idea that explosions are the climax of catastrophe, but often they are only the opening. Afterward comes heat, confusion, rescue, waiting, and in many disasters, the long struggle against what cannot easily be extinguished. Arizona entered that long struggle. The forward section was devastated beyond recognition. Steel twisted under unimaginable force. Compartments had collapsed. Passageways were blocked. Where structure had once imposed order, there was now wreckage and flame. And beneath parts of that burning ruin, hundreds were already dead. Others were trapped. That knowledge haunted survivors almost immediately, because fire, unlike explosion, extends time. It makes people witness what destruction continues to do. From nearby ships and shore, men looked toward Arizona and saw flames pouring upward. Some saw burning oil drifting across the harbor surface. Some saw sailors in water coated with fuel. Some saw men trying to escape heat by plunging overboard. And still, the ship burned. The harbor itself seemed changed by the fire. Morning light disappeared behind smoke. The air thickened. The smell of burning metal, oil, explosives, and salt water merged into something survivors would remember for life. Certain events remain in memory, not through image alone, but through atmosphere. And Pearl Harbor's atmosphere, after Arizona exploded, was fire. Fire on steel, fire on water, fire reflected where dawn had reflected only calm. Even rescue became uncertain. How do you approach a ship still burning How do you save those trapped inside twisted compartments where heat remains lethal? Men tried, launchers moved, wounded were pulled from water, burn victims were treated where possible, others could not be reached. That may be one of history's hardest truths. Sometimes courage does not overcome disaster. Sometimes courage only enters it and still enters, even knowing. Some witnesses later spoke of hearing cries. Others remembered only noise. Others remembered silence in places where sound should have been. Memory, after trauma, often fractures. But many agreed on one thing: the fire seemed endless. It did not behave like something that should simply burn out. It fed on oil, on wreckage, on what remained within the ship, and it continued through day into night and beyond. For days, Arizona kept burning. That fact alone can feel almost unreal. A warship struck in one moment, yet still burning days later, as if destruction itself refused to release its hold. In late-night history, this has a particular weight because extended fire alters the emotional shape of catastrophe. An explosion shocks, a long fire grieves. It forces time to remain with loss, to stay beside it, to watch, and watching can wound in ways impact alone does not. For survivors, the burning Arizona became not only a destroyed ship, but visible proof of those who remained inside. The flames marked absence. Each hour they continued seemed to say, they are still there. And indeed they were. More than 900 men would remain entombed in the wreck, even as fire consumed what could be consumed above, even as the harbor moved toward salvage elsewhere, even as war widened beyond Hawaii. Arizona stayed, burning first, then smoldering, then settling into a silence made heavier because of what had preceded it. There is another image from those days that returns often: oil spreading across water, black, reflective, disturbed by movement, sometimes burning, sometimes merely drifting. That oil would become part of Arizona's memory, because even long after fire ended, oil would continue rising from the wreck, slowly, like the ship remembering. But in those first days, it was not memory yet. It was hazard. It was evidence. It was part of the burning itself. And there is something haunting in how water, the thing one imagines quenching fire, could not stop this one. The harbor held the ship, but did not extinguish it. Even the sea could not fully quiet what had happened. And perhaps that is why Arizona occupies such a singular place in American memory, not only because she exploded, not only because so many died, but because the destruction lingered visibly, refused quick disappearance, made mourning physical. Smoke could be seen, fire could be watched, loss could not be abstracted. It stood in the harbor, burning. At some point, flames lowered, smoke thinned. The worst of visible fire began to pass, but by then the ship that had awakened at dawn no longer existed as she had been. What remained was wreck, grave, beginning of memorial, though no one would have called it that yet. Not while smoke still drifted, not while the dead were still being counted, not while war itself had only just begun. And perhaps this is where part one ends, not with the bomb, not even with the explosion, but with fire that would not go out, because history is often remembered through moment, but lived through durations. And for Arizona, destruction was not only a single blast at 8 o'clock, it was also The long burning after, the hours when steel glowed, the days when smoke still rose, the slow recognition that some losses do not end when the violence ends. They remain like embers, like oil on water, like a ship resting beneath a harbor, still holding fire in memory. Why they did not raise Arizona. After the fires diminished and smoke no longer rose over the harbor in great black columns, another question began, slowly and unavoidably, to take shape. What would become of the wreck? In the weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the harbor itself became a place not only of mourning, but of labor. Salvage crews moved among damaged ships. Divers descended into flooded compartments. Engineers studied wreckage. The United States Navy, even in shock, had already begun thinking in terms of recovery. War allowed little pause. Ships that could be repaired might return to service. Ships that could be refloated might fight again, and many did. USS West Virginia, though heavily damaged, would eventually be raised. USS California too. Even the overturned USS Oklahoma was the subject of immense salvage efforts, though she would never return to war. In those months, much of Battleship Row became a problem to solve, but Arizona was different, and very early, men understood how different, because what the explosion had done was not merely sink the ship, it had destroyed her structurally. The forward magazines had detonated with such violence that large sections of the vessel were devastated beyond ordinary salvage. The ship had not simply flooded, she had been broken, and there is a difference between a sunken ship and a shattered one. One may be raised, the other may resist being restored to anything resembling what it was. Salvage divers who entered the wreck found twisted steel, collapsed spaces, and damage so severe that the idea of returning Arizona to service quickly faded. There would be recovery work. There would be removal of some materials. There would be limited operations, but raising the ship whole, that was something else, and increasingly, something unlikely. Yet technical difficulty alone does not fully explain why Arizona remained where she sank. Another truth lay beneath engineering. The dead, more than 1,100 sailors and Marines had been killed aboard USS Arizona. Hundreds of bodies had not been recovered. Hundreds remained entombed within the wreck. And very early, Arizona came to be understood not only as damaged naval property, but as a mass grave. That changes how people think. It changes what recovery means. It changes what disturbance may cost. Because raising the ship would not have meant merely lifting steel. It could have meant disturbing the resting place of the dead. And in war, there are moments when practical decisions become moral ones. Arizona became one of those moments. There is something profound in this, because nations often salvage what can be used, repair what can fight, reclaim what can serve again. But here, another instinct emerged. Leave her where she fell, not as abandonment, as recognition. Recognition that some wrecks are no longer only wrecks. They have become burial ground, and burial grounds are approached differently. In late night reflection, this decision feels almost quiet in its dignity. No grand declaration, no dramatic gesture. Simply, over time, an understanding settling into place. She would remain. There were still operations on the ship, of course. Guns and useful materials were removed. Parts of the vessel were studied. War demanded resources, but the hull itself stayed on the harbor floor, partly by necessity, partly by reverence, and perhaps by something even harder to define, a sense that moving the ship would violate the meaning it had already acquired, because Arizona had become more than a battleship. She had become memory made physical, a place where the attack still existed in material form, steel still bearing violence, compartments still holding the absent, history not interpreted but present, and that presence mattered. It still matters. There is also the practical scale to consider. Even had one wished to raise her fully, such an effort would have been immense, dangerous, expensive, uncertain, and all while the United States was now at war across oceans. Resources were needed elsewhere. Attention moved towards survival. In a much larger conflict, sometimes history's most enduring decisions arise not from one reason, but from many converging: technical impossibility, human reverence, military necessity, moral hesitation. Arizona sat at their intersection and remained. Years passed. The war ended. Other wrecks elsewhere were forgotten, scrapped, or erased, but Arizona stayed visible beneath shallow harbor water, not hidden in deep ocean darkness like RMS Titanic, not lost beyond reach, but present near the surface where memory could keep returning. And return it did. Visitors came, survivors returned, families came searching for proximity to those who never came home. Eventually, a memorial would span above the wreck, but before memorial came decision, and before decision came refusal. Refusal to treat this ship as merely salvage. There is something almost rare in modern history about that, to allow destruction to remain visible, to preserve wreckage, rather than erase it, to accept ruin itself as testimony. Most societies rebuild over damage. Arizona was left as damage intentionally, and because of that, the ship continued speaking through silence, through rusting steel, through oil rising slowly to the surface, through absence. Perhaps that is why the question, why did they not raise Arizona, feels larger than it first appears. It is not only about engineering, it is about what we do with places where too many died. Do we restore them, remove them, or leave them as witnesses? At Pearl Harbor, one answer settled beneath the water: leave her where she sank. And in doing so, the Navy preserved not only a wreck, but a grave, a warning, and a memory the sea would never fully conceal. Divers in the wreck. After the decision emerged that USS Arizona would not be raised in the way other damaged ships were, another kind of descent began, not by the ship, by men, divers. And there is something uniquely unsettling about entering a wreck that is also a grave, because a sunken ship is never only structure underwater. It is corridors without light, rooms altered by pressure, objects left where lives stopped, and in Arizona's case, the dead still within. The first Navy divers who went into the wreck did not descend as explorers in the romantic sense people sometimes imagine today. They descended because war required information, assessment, recovery, possibility. Even inside devastation, the military thinks in terms of what remains usable, what can be understood, what may still be done. But once below the surface, those practical purposes met something far older and harder to describe: silence inside ruin. Pearl Harbor, above water, still carried movement, boats, voices, work. But beneath the surface, around the broken hull, another atmosphere existed: filtered light, suspended particles, steel darkened by water, and the strange way sound behaves when men breathe through apparatus and hear mostly themselves. In late night history, it is difficult not to pause here, because diving into Arizona in those early years was not like entering a ship one recognized. The explosion had altered geometry itself. Passageways twisted, bulkheads collapsed, compartments partly buried in silt. Places once ordered by naval design made unfamiliar, sometimes nearly impossible to read. And this is one of the haunting truths of wrecks. Disaster rearranges space. A doorway may no longer be a doorway. A corridor may end in crushed steel. A room may exist, but no longer as a human being would recognize it. Divers moved through such spaces carefully, sometimes by touch as much as sight, sometimes with visibility so poor that distance dissolved after only a few feet. Silt could rise at the slightest disturbance, turning water opaque, making orientation uncertain. Even experienced divers know how dangerous that can be. Inside wrecks, disorientation kills, and Arizona held all the risks wreck diving still holds: entanglement, collapse, darkness, loss of direction. But for those early divers, there was something more: memory pressing against the work. Because this was not ancient archaeology, this was recent death. Men entered spaces where others had died only weeks or months before. That changes perception, even if unspoken. Some accounts from early salvage era diving described finding remnants of ordinary shipboard life amid destruction, equipment, personal effects, unmoved objects in impossible surroundings. And perhaps this is always what unsettles most: not wreckage itself, but signs of interrupted normalcy. A thing where someone left it, a place clearly once inhabited, still carrying traces of routine. Disaster often feels most human there, not in explosions, in remnants. Divers also studied damage, how the explosion had torn the ship, how far collapse extended, what could be removed, what could not, and increasingly, what should not be disturbed, because entering the wreck made abstraction impossible. The dead were no longer an idea associated with Arizona. Their presence shaped the reality of the ship. This was where they remained, inside compartments now flooded and dark, inside steel altered by blast, inside the ship that had become their final place. And perhaps no one understood that more directly than the men who entered. There is something almost monastic in underwater labor around war wrecks: slow movement, measured breathing, attention, respect, often expressed not through words, but through caution, through not rushing, through not treating the sight as ordinary. And many divers who later worked around Arizona spoke in different ways of feeling that distinction, as though the wreck demanded a certain seriousness, not superstition, recognition. Meanwhile, above the wreck, history continued. The war widened across the Pacific. Battles were fought, ships were lost elsewhere, but Arizona remained in the harbor, and divers kept returning, sometimes for technical surveys, sometimes for recovery tasks, sometimes later for preservation and study. Each descent revealing a little more, and perhaps also revealing how much would remain unknown. Because even when men enter a wreck, wrecks keep secrets. Some compartments remain inaccessible. Some damage cannot be fully mapped. Some histories remain partly buried in steel and silk. Arizona, despite all surveys, still holds such silences, and perhaps always will. There is another detail worth lingering on: light. Because people imagine shipwrecks as uniformly dark, but Arizona lies in relatively shallow water, and filtered daylight enters. Not bright as surface light, but enough to create shifting illumination, enough for shapes to emerge, enough, perhaps, to make the wreck feel even more ghostly. Because partial light often unsettles more than complete darkness. It reveals, but incompletely, and incomplete revelation can haunt. A ladder descending into shadow, a structural beam appearing through green water, a corridor vanishing where silt thickens. These are the visual language of submerged memory, and divers moved through them, breathing, watching, working, trying to understand a ship history had broken open. In time, the divers themselves became part of Arizona's story. Not only the sailors who died, but those who returned below to witness what remained, to document, to preserve, to leave much undisturbed. And perhaps this section ends best, not with a discovery, but with an image: a diver hovering motionless inside damaged steel, light falling faintly through harbor water, silt drifting, no voices, only breathing, and beyond the beam of a lamp, spaces where no one goes, still holding their silence. The dead still inside. There is a sentence often spoken about USS Arizona that sounds almost impossible the first time one hears it. Most of her dead are still aboard, not remembered aboard, not symbolically aboard, still aboard, inside the wreck, inside the ship where they died. And perhaps no fact shapes Arizona's meaning more deeply than this one, because many war graves exist in distant fields, some beneath rows of white markers, some known by name, some are unknown. But Arizona is different. It is a grave that remains physically joined to the event that created it. The place of death and the place of burial are the same. There is something almost unbearable in that closeness. More than 1,100 sailors and Marines were killed when the ship exploded. Most were never recovered. Many could not be. The violence had been too sudden, the destruction too severe, the fire too intense, and afterward, practical recovery gave way to another reality. For many aboard, the ship itself had become the only possible resting place, and so they remained. Years passed, decades passed, but the dead remained. This transformed Arizona from a wreck into something much more solemn, an active military cemetery, a naval tomb, not metaphorically, literally. And words like wreck begin to feel too mechanical once one sits with that, because a wreck is something lost, a tomb is something kept. Arizona became kept. There is a profound moral seriousness in how this changed behavior around the ship. Divers approached differently. Visitors approached differently. The Navy approached differently. Because once a place is understood as holding the dead, conduct changes. It should, and largely, it did. In late-night reflection, perhaps what moves one most is not the number, though the number is staggering, but the thought of individuals remaining where ordinary life ended. A cook, a signalman, a young sailor far from home, a marine at duty, lives interrupted and never physically brought elsewhere, still joined to the steel around them. There is something almost ancient in this, despite its modern setting, like burial within a fortress, like warriors left where they fell. And perhaps that is why Arizona carries a gravity even visitors often feel before they can explain it. Some places hold memory, some places hold the dead. This one holds both. There is another dimension few outside the story know. Some survivors of Arizona later chose, after their own deaths, to have their cremated remains placed within the wreck alongside shipmates. An extraordinary decision, and a deeply human one, to return in death to those one served beside in youth, to rejoin a crew separated by decades. This practice, carried out under careful Navy procedures, gave Arizona a meaning almost no ordinary memorial possesses. The ship is not only a place where men died in 1941, it has continued, in rare cases, to receive them. Even history itself does not often offer such continuity. It is hard to think of many other graves that remain active in this way. Perhaps it says something profound about loyalty, that some men, having lived entire lives afterward, still wished finally to return to the ship, not to a cemetery ashore, not elsewhere, but there, inside the wreck, inside memory. And yet, Arizona's dead are not visible. This matters because many memorials confront through names, markers, statues. Arizona confronts through absence. You stand above water, you do not see those below. And precisely because you do not see them, imagination must do what sight cannot. Perhaps that makes the place more powerful. The mind senses what lies beneath, and in sensing, grows quieter. There is also something difficult in the word entombed. It can sound dramatic, but here it is exact. Steel became tomb, the ship became sepulchre, and the sea, rather than dispersing the dead, enclosed them. That is not how many imagine the ocean. We think of water as movement. Arizona suggests another truth. Water can preserve, hold, keep silence intact. That silence is part of the memorial. Visitors often speak softly there, almost instinctively. Even children often do, as if the place teaches behavior. And perhaps it does, because reverence is sometimes learned not through instruction, but atmosphere. The atmosphere above Arizona teaches without speaking. There have also been ethical debates over the years. How much intrusion is appropriate? How much study? How much access? Questions like these arise precisely because the dead remain inside, and because the wreck is not merely historical artifact, it is human resting place. This distinction matters enormously. It governs what should be touched, what should be left, what should remain unknown. For perhaps not every silence ought to be broken. In a culture often eager to uncover everything, Arizona stands as a quiet argument that some things may deserve preservation through restraint, not because knowledge lacks value, but because reverence also has value and sometimes must limit knowledge. Perhaps that is one of Arizona's deepest lessons, that history is not only something we investigate, sometimes it is something we guard. As night thinking drifts over the harbor, one can imagine the ship below, steel darkened by decades, coral growing, oil rising slowly, compartments still closed, and within, those who never left, still part of the vessel, still part of the story, still part of the silence. And that silence changes everything, because once one understands the dead are still inside, the ship is never merely a ship again. Oil that still rises. Long after the fire was extinguished, long after the war ended, long after survivors grew old and returned as visitors rather than sailors, something continued to rise from USS Arizona. Oil, not in dramatic bursts, not in great slicks spreading across the harbor, but slowly, drop by drop, a sheen, a dark bead surfacing, a thin iridescent film drifting over water, so slight a visitor might miss it, and yet once noticed, almost impossible to forget, because there is something profoundly unsettling about a ship destroyed in 1941, still releasing oil today, as though part of the morning of December 7 has never entirely ended. The oil comes from fuel trapped within the wreck, from tanks damaged but never emptied, from a ship that, despite explosion, fire, and decades underwater, still holds within itself remnants of the material that once powered it. And every so often, some small portion escapes, rises, reaches light, touches the surface. There is an old phrase, often used by those who have stood above the memorial, the Black Tears of Arizona. It is not an official technical term, it is a poetic one, but sometimes poetry approaches truth where engineering cannot, because what people sense in those droplets is not simply petroleum, it is continuity. The wreck still speaking, still leaking memory into the present. In late night reflection, this detail has almost mythic force. A battleship's grave, a grave that still releases dark traces of its last day. There are few historical sites where physical evidence of catastrophe continues appearing in real time. Arizona does, and that changes how one experiences the place, because history there is not entirely past. Something still emerges. There is, of course, science behind this. Researchers have studied the wreck's condition, the integrity of the hull, the behavior of remaining fuel. There have been concerns, questions about whether corrosion might someday lead to larger release, questions about preservation, questions about how to protect both memorial and harbor. These are real and practical matters, but even practical matters can carry emotional weight, because preserving Arizona means preserving not only steel, but a place where oil still rises. And the oil complicates everything. It is symbol, but also substance, memory, but also environmental reality. Few memorials carry both at once. Perhaps that is part of why Arizona feels so singular. Even its symbolism floats physically on water. Visitors often see the droplets unexpectedly, a small black pearl forming at the surface, then spreading into a shimmer, rainbow colors, sometimes flickering in sunlight, beauty and sorrow strangely mingle, and perhaps that mixture itself feels true to history. For history often holds both the beautiful and the grievous, the reflective and the ruin. The oil seems almost to embody this, dark yet luminous at the edges. There is something nearly impossible not to anthropomorphize in it, to feel, however irrationally, that the ship is breathing, that the wreck remains alive in some slow geological sense. People say such things not because they believe steel lives, but because ordinary language struggles before places like this. So metaphor enters. The ship weeps, the ship breathes, the ship remembers. None literally true, yet each expressing something people genuinely feel, and feeling too belongs to history. There is also an eerie scale to consider. For more than 80 years, those drops have risen. Think of that. Generations have come and gone. Wars have begun and ended. Presidents have passed. Children of survivors have become old. And still, sometimes oil rises. Duration itself becomes part of the meaning. A moment of destruction extended across decades by these slow black traces. History lengthened by droplets. In a way, the oil refuses clean closure. It does not let the event become entirely sealed in archives. It reappears at the surface again and again. Perhaps this is why so many people, even those not usually drawn to military history, are moved by Arizona, because the place communicates through elemental things: water, steel, silence, oil. Nothing abstract, nothing requiring explanation. You can see the sheen and understand immediately that something old is still present. There have been debates, naturally, about how to speak of the oil. Some caution against romanticizing it, and that caution has merit, because the dead deserve seriousness, not sentimentality. Yet even seriousness does not cancel wonder. One may acknowledge environmental fact and still feel something profound watching those droplets rise. The two do not exclude one another. Perhaps reverence often lives exactly there, where fact and feeling meet. At night, imagining the harbor quiet, the memorial empty, the water dark under moonlight, one can almost picture it: a still surface, then a small disturbance, a dark bead emerging from below, lifting from a wreck no one fully sees, reaching open air, spreading thin, disappearing. Then later, another and another, as though time itself was surfacing in fragments. Perhaps this is where part 2 closes, with oil, not fire, with slow emergence, not explosion, because part 1 was about destruction arriving. Part 2 has been about what remained: the grave, the divers, the dead still inside, and finally, the strange, persistent sign that the ship has never entirely fallen silent. For even now, beneath the memorial, beneath the water, inside the rusting hull, something still rises. What divers found in the dark. There is a difference between entering a wreck to survive it and returning decades later to study what time has done. The first divers who entered USS Arizona confronted fresh devastation. Later divers confronted something stranger, a disaster transformed by time, because time underwater does not simply preserve, it alters, softens some things, consumes others, lets marine life enter where men once worked, and in doing so, it creates a place that is neither wholly ship nor wholly reef, but something between. What divers found in Arizona over the decades belongs to that in-between world, and much of it was discovered not in dramatic revelations, but through careful looking, slow observation, the kind that late-night history understands well, because some discoveries arrive quietly. One of the first things divers encountered was how much of the ship still remained. For those who imagined Arizona reduced to scattered ruin, this could be surprising. Large structural elements endured, massive sections of hull, turrets, gun positions, interior spaces, though altered, fragments of the ship's architecture, still recognizable despite violence and corrosion. The wreck had not vanished, it had changed, and there is a profound difference, because disappearance suggests absence, change suggests persistence. Arizona persisted, though differently. Divers studying the great gun turrets often found them among the most haunting features. Immense armored structures, once symbols of naval power, now resting in eerie stillness. The guns no longer aimed at anything, no longer instruments of war, only relics. And perhaps there is something especially moving when objects built for force survive long enough to become quiet. Power becoming silence, weapons becoming ruins. Time does that. There were also smaller findings, equipment still present, fittings, mechanical components, fragments of life aboard ship, embedded within wreckage. Not museum objects arranged for interpretation, but things where history left them. That matters, because objects displaced tell one story. Objects remaining in place tell another. They preserve relationship. This belonged here. This was used here. This remained when the people did not. And such things can feel almost unbearably intimate. A valve, a ladder, a fixture bolted to steel. Ordinary things. Until history touches them, then no longer ordinary. Some divers described being struck by how recognizable certain spaces remained despite destruction. A section of passageway, an opening suggesting former movement, the geometry of human design still legible beneath damage. And perhaps that is what unsettles, not total ruin, partial familiarity, because partial familiarity invites imagination. You can picture men moving here, working here, speaking here, and then that imagined life meets present silence. That meeting can haunt. In late-night reflection, one must also consider what divers found not as objects, but as processes: corrosion, decay, marine colonization, evidence that the wreck was not static. Arizona was changing, even as it was studied. This too was a discovery. That wrecks continue happening. They do not simply sit unchanged, awaiting observation. They evolve. Steel thins, surfaces collapse, life grows. Time continues its own slow work, long after explosions end. And perhaps understanding that alters how we think of historical remains, not as frozen past, but as ongoing transformation. Divers also found limits, places inaccessible, spaces too dangerous, areas where silt, collapse, or ethical restraint prevented entry. This is important because what divers found is inseparable from what they did not, and perhaps could not. Every wreck contains unknowns, Arizona especially. Some compartments remain largely silent to investigation. Some details remain inferred rather than seen, and perhaps there is dignity in admitting that not all history yields fully. Some remains partly hidden. There is another dimension difficult to overlook: marine life, fish moving through openings where sailors once moved, coral attaching to war steel, living systems entering structures made for battle. Many divers have remarked on this strange conjunction: death becoming habitat, violence becoming environment. It can feel almost paradoxical, and yet the sea often works precisely through such paradox. It does not preserve according to human categories, it transforms. Perhaps what divers found most deeply then was not only remnants of a battleship, but evidence of that transformation. Arizona becoming something other than the thing she had been. Still a grave, still a memorial, still a ship, yet also becoming reef, becoming underwater landscape, becoming, in some slow marine sense, alive with forms never intended by its builders. And perhaps few discoveries are stranger than that. One imagines wreck study as uncovering the past, but sometimes it reveals the present happening inside the past. Life moving through ruin, time inhabiting history. There were later surveys using increasingly advanced tools, imaging, mapping, documentation, more precise than early divers could have imagined, and each brought new knowledge. But even the best technology did not replace what human presence perceived: scale, atmosphere, silence, the emotional fact of hovering beside a gun turret under green harbor light. Some things instruments record, some only persons encounter, and history needs both. Perhaps this section ends with one of those encounters: a diver pausing near the massive forward guns, steel darkened by decades, small fish moving past, light wavering from the surface far above. No sound except breathing, and the realization that what lies before him is not simply wreckage, but a warship, a grave, a reef, and a memory all at once. Coral growing on battleship steel. There is a strange tenderness in the thought that after fire, explosion, and death, something living began to grow. Not immediately, not as consolation. The sea does not console, but over years, then decades, the steel of USS Arizona became host to life. Coral, small at first, then spreading, attaching to surfaces built never to hold such things. And perhaps few images in maritime history carry more quiet contradiction than coral growing on a battleship, because battleships were made for force, armor, guns, shock. Coral belongs to another order entirely. Slow accumulation, fragility, though resilient, growth measured not in minutes, like explosions, but in years. And yet, here they meet. War steel, living reef. The sea often creates such meetings. It ignores the categories humans build: weapon, habitat, grave. It can make one thing become another. Arizona became part of that process. Divers over the decades noticed marine colonization increasing. Hard surfaces offered attachment points. Metal, though artificial, became substrate, and organisms responded. Corals, algae, sponges, other forms of marine life gradually entered the architecture of the wreck, not invading perhaps inhabiting. There is a difference. To invade implies violation. To inhabit suggests transformation, and transformation feels closer to what occurred. In late-night reflection, this can feel almost impossible not to read symbolically. Life growing where violence ended, but even without symbolism, the fact itself is remarkable enough. A machine of war becoming ecological structure. Few builders of Arizona could have imagined such an afterlife. Perhaps no one aboard in 1941 could have imagined it either, that the hull which became tomb would also slowly become living surface. That fish would move through openings. That coral would hold to armor plate. That biological time would continue where human time stopped. And perhaps that is one of the sea's oldest lessons. Nothing remains entirely what it was. Even ruins enter process. There are particular kinds of coral associated with submerged structures in Hawaiian waters. Though growth patterns vary and the wreck's condition shapes what can flourish, researchers and divers have observed how marine communities establish themselves unevenly. Some surfaces support more life, some less. Exposure, current, light, material, all matter. Even in transformation, there is complexity, and perhaps complexity itself resists romantic simplification. Arizona did not become some seamless tropical reef. She became something more complicated. Part wreck, part grave, part artificial habitat. Always multiple things at once. That multiplicity matters, because otherwise one risks turning history into metaphor and losing the ship. The ship remains. Steel still matters. The dead still matter. Coral does not replace that. It grows beside it, upon it, within a reality already solemn. And perhaps precisely because of that, the coral feels more moving, not less, because life here does not erase tragedy. It coexists with it. There is something profound in coexistence. Many divers have spoken of seeing small fish gather near encrusted structures, moving where once sailors moved. The comparison comes almost involuntarily. Human pathways becoming marine pathways, one form of motion replaced by another. And though such thoughts can feel haunting, they can also feel strangely peaceful, not because loss is healed, but because the sea has not left the wreck barren. There is presence there, living presence, even among the dead. Some have called wrecks like Arizona artificial reefs. Technically, the term fits in part, yet Arizona resists being reduced to technical category, because most artificial reefs are discussed in ecological terms. Arizona can never be only ecological. History clings too closely. Still, ecology belongs to the story, and must, because the living systems on the wreck are part of what the wreck has become. To ignore that would also distort truth. Late-night history often lingers where truths overlap. This is one of those places. War and biology, memory and marine succession, death and growth, none cancelling the others, all present. There is perhaps also something humbling in coral itself. People often imagine coral as delicate decoration, yet reefs can outlast empires, persist across spans human politics scarcely comprehend. Battleships once symbolized permanence, but coral, in its own slow way, may prove the deeper endurance. That thought carries quiet irony. The organism overlooked as fragile, outlasting the machine built as mighty. History sometimes speaks through such reversals, and perhaps Arizona contains one. Researchers also study whether biological growth affects preservation, whether marine colonization may in some places protect surfaces, in others complicate deterioration. These questions matter because even life on the wreck participates in the larger story of its survival and change. Nothing here is separate. Steel affects coral. Coral affects steel. Time affects both. History and biology intertwined. One can imagine a diver hovering near encrusted metal, touching nothing, watching coral forms fixed where guns once commanded, seeing fish move through filtered green light, and sensing, perhaps not contradiction, but a larger continuity, that the sea, without intention, has taken a warship into processes older than war, that even violence can be absorbed into longer rhythms, not redeemed, absorbed. There is a difference, and it matters, for redemption suggests suffering made worthwhile. History should be cautious there, but absorption, that is something the sea undeniably does. It absorbs wrecks, it absorbs memory into landscape, it absorbs steel into reef. Arizona bears witness to that. Perhaps this section closes with that image. Coral attached to armor plate, small life holding fast to war metal. No sound, no battle, only water moving gently over a ship once broken by fire. And on the steel, where destruction once opened, something living continues to grow. The slow collapse. There is a tendency, when people imagine historic wrecks, to picture them as fixed, as though once a ship sinks, its final shape is decided, its story complete, its form preserved in a kind of underwater stillness. But wrecks do not remain still. They continue changing, quietly, slowly, often almost invisibly. And nowhere is that more haunting than with USS Arizona, because Arizona is not only a wreck that survived, it is a wreck still aging, still weakening, still moving in subtle ways toward forms no one can fully predict. This is what some call the slow collapse, not a single dramatic failure, not one sudden moment when the ship simply disappears, but the long process by which steel underwater, exposed to corrosion, stress, marine growth, and time, gradually loses what it once held. And perhaps that is a harder kind of destruction to comprehend, because explosions are immediate. Slow collapse asks us to think in decades, to imagine ruin unfolding almost too slowly to see, yet unfolding nonetheless. Researchers who study Arizona have long monitored the condition of the wreck. The concern is not abstract. Steel corrodes, supports weaken, structures once held in balance can shift. Sections damaged in 1941 still carry the consequences of that violence. Time does not erase those stresses, it often deepens them. And so the ship, though resting in apparent stillness, is under constant material negotiation, holding, yielding, holding again. This is one of the strange truths of old wrecks. They can seem motionless, while change never stops. In late-night reflection, this can feel almost like listening to an old building settle at night. Tiny sounds, tiny movements, nothing dramatic, yet evidence of age working. Arizona settles too, only in steel and salt water rather than wood and air. Some fears have long centered on whether parts of the wreck might someday suffer major structural failure, sections collapsing inward, supports giving way, areas already inaccessible becoming further altered. And such concerns carry more than engineering significance, because this is not merely historic fabric at risk, it is also a war grave. Any change in the wreck touches memory, preservation, and reverence all at once. There is no purely technical discussion here. There cannot be. Every question about deterioration becomes also a question about what can be protected and what cannot. Perhaps one of the hardest things to accept is that preservation does not mean preventing all loss. Sometimes it means managing inevitable change, slowing it, understanding it, responding where possible, but not imagining one can make steel immortal. No preservation can fully defeat time. Arizona teaches that with unusual clarity. Even memorials age, even graves alter, even warships become fragile. There is humility in that, and perhaps some sorrow too, because people often wish places of memory could be held unchanged forever. But forever does not belong easily to material things, not even to steel battleships. Divers and researchers, using surveys, imaging, and structural studies, have tried to understand how Arizona is changing, where corrosion is advancing, where stresses remain, where collapse risks may lie. This work is meticulous, patient, and in its own way, reverent, because to study deterioration here is not to reduce the wreck to mechanics. It is to care for what remains, to pay attention. Attention itself can be a form of honor. There is another unsettling layer, the possibility that the ship may someday look markedly different than it does now. Not tomorrow, perhaps not soon, but over long spans. Future visitors may encounter a wreck altered from the one seen today. Memory itself may someday rest above a changed physical reality. This too belongs to history. Historical sites are not exempt from time merely because they matter. Sometimes they matter partly because time can still reach them. That vulnerability deepens rather than diminishes their significance. And perhaps vulnerability is part of what gives Arizona such emotional force. The ship is not a perfect monument carved in stone. It is wounded matter persisting, still exposed, still mortal. In a sense one rarely applies to ships, but perhaps may hear a mortal memorial. That phrase may sound strange, yet it carries truth. There is also something almost philosophical in slow collapse. It resists the dramatic narratives humans prefer. No climax, no decisive ending, only gradual diminishment. And much of life, perhaps, resembles that more than explosions do. Age often arrives this way. Civilizations too. Buildings, bodies, even memory can erode by increments. Perhaps Arizona feels intimate, partly because its aging echoes other forms of aging we know, only slower, larger, underwater, and watched. Some might ask whether one day the wreck will entirely disappear. In one sense, not for a very long time. In another sense, disappearance has already begun. Wherever original form has been lost, loss is not only future, it is ongoing. That is what slow collapse means. Not impending ruin, prisoned process, and perhaps understanding that changes how one imagines the ship tonight, not as static beneath the memorial, but as something still in history, still undergoing time, still becoming, even in decay. Perhaps this section closes with a quieter image than one might expect, not steel breaking, not dramatic collapse, but a diver studying a seam in old metal, a place where corrosion has thinned what war once left damaged. Harbor light wavering overhead, no visible movement, yet change occurring slowly, silently, like history continuing after people think it has stopped. And beneath the memorial, beneath the water, beneath the weight of decades, the ship still holds, but not forever. Echoes beneath the memorial. Most visitors to the USS Arizona Memorial arrive first by light. Bright Hawaiian sun, white structure above blue water, the harbor appearing almost serene. And there is something quietly disorienting in that first impression, because the memorial seems, at a glance, so calm, so spare, so still, a clean white span resting over water, almost weightless. And yet, directly beneath it lies the broken hull of USS Arizona, the grave, the wreck, the ship whose presence gives the memorial meaning. Without the wreck below, the structure above would be something else entirely. It is the relationship between them that matters. And perhaps nowhere in this story is the idea of visible silence more powerful, because what visitors stand above, they largely do not see. They sense, they infer, they imagine, and that imagination can become its own kind of echo. Hence, perhaps the truest echoes beneath the memorial are not sounds in the ordinary sense, but continuities, things still resonating though unheard. There is a temptation to think memorials are about what they add to history, plaques, architecture, interpretation. But some memorials do something different. They frame what already exists. The Arizona Memorial does not replace the wreck. It hovers over it, protects attention, directs attention, invites a particular kind of looking, or perhaps a particular kind of listening, even when no sound comes. In late night reflection, this feels important because many people speak of a hush at the memorial, not simply because visitors are asked to be respectful, but because the place itself seems to generate quiet, voices lower, movement slow, even footsteps can feel altered, as though people sense they are not at an ordinary monument, and perhaps they are sensing precisely what lies below, the unseen shaping behavior above. That is a kind of echo, something below influencing something above, history acting upward. There have been many accounts over the years, from visitors, survivors, and guides, describing a powerful emotional atmosphere there. Some speak of grief, some of reverence, some of an inexplicable heaviness, others of peace. Such responses differ, yet they often share one feature: the sense that the place exceeds ordinary tourism. It asks more, and perhaps gives more. There is another physical dimension often overlooked. Standing on the memorial, one may sometimes see the outline of the wreck beneath the water, not fully, not continuously, but suggested, dark mass under surface light, hints of structure, a presence more than a view. And perhaps suggestion can be more powerful than full revelation, because suggestion leaves room for thought. spot for inwardness, for memory to work. If the wreck were displayed plainly like museum artifact, the experience would be different, more explicit, perhaps less profound. Hiddenness here is part of the meaning. What cannot be fully seen cannot be casually consumed. It resists easy viewing. Maybe that resistance is appropriate. There is also the memorial's design itself, its long white form, sagging slightly at center and rising at the ends, has often invited interpretation. Some see defeat yielding to victory. Others simply see a modernist gesture of mourning. Whatever one sees, the structure's openness matters. It does not enclose. It lets light, air, and water remain present. The elements stay part of the memorial, and because of that, the wreck below never feels separated from the harbor around it. Sea and memory remain joined. This too creates echoes. Water moving under a memorial, light shifting over a grave, the present continually passing over the past, and yet not erasing it. One could say the memorial amplifies silence, an odd phrase, but perhaps true. For silence, that does not feel empty. It feels full, full of name, full of absence, full of what remains unspoken. And perhaps this is why the names carved on the memorial carry such force. The dead are named above. The dead remain below. Name and resting place held in vertical relationship. Words over water, lives beneath. It is difficult to think of many memorials arranged so directly, and perhaps that directness is why the place lingers in people long after leaving. There have even been discussions over the years about sounds sometimes heard or imagined at sites of memory. Echoes, voices, presences. History should be cautious with such things. Better perhaps to understand echoes here less as ghost stories than as resonance. The way events continue affecting consciousness, the way one stands in silence and feels addressed by what happened. That is echo enough, no legends required. The wreck provides it, the memorial receives it, visitors participate in it. A threefold relation: ship, structure, witness, all necessary. As night thinking settles over the harbor, imagine the memorial empty after visitors have gone, white against dark water, moonlight touching the surface, no voices, only harbor sound, and below the hull, coral on steel, oil perhaps rising somewhere unseen, compartments closed, the dead still within, and above them, spanning that silence, the memorial, not speaking, yet somehow full of echoes. Perhaps this is where part 3 ends, not in collapse, not in coral, but in the strange truth that what lies beneath can continue sounding through what stands above, and sometimes the deepest echoes are the ones heard only in silence. Robert Ballard returns. There is a curious way certain names begin attaching themselves to the deep. Some explorers do not merely visit wrecks, they become associated with how we imagine the hidden world itself. Robert Ballard is one of those names. For many, he is linked first with the discovery of RMS Titanic, a ship lost in abyssal darkness, a revelation from nearly 2.5 miles below the Atlantic. But years after Titanic entered public imagination through his work, Ballard returned to another wreck, not in the open ocean, in a harbor, not a liner, a battleship, not a newly discovered loss, a place long known, long mourned, yet still holding questions. USS Arizona, and there is something almost fitting in that return, because Titanic had revealed the drama of finding what was lost. Arizona asked something quieter. How does one return to what was never lost, only never fully seen? That is a different kind of exploration, perhaps a deeper one. By the late 20th century, underwater archaeology and remote survey technologies had changed profoundly. Tools that could image wrecks without disturbing them, methods shaped partly by deep ocean work, techniques capable of studying fragile sites with new care. Ballard brought some of that sensibility to Arizona, not to discover the ship, but to look again. And sometimes, looking again changes understanding more than first seeing. That may be one of history's hidden rules. Revisiting matters. Ballard's involvement also carried symbolic weight. The man associated with revealing Titanic, returning to one of America's most sacred war wrecks, linked two kinds of maritime memory: civilian tragedy, military loss, deep ocean mystery, shallow water grave. Very different sites, yet joined by questions of preservation, ethics, and what wrecks mean after their sinking. And Ballard, perhaps more than many, stood at that intersection. In late-night reflection, what feels striking is that Arizona did not need dramatic unveiling. No headlines announcing found, no shock of first contact. The wreck had been there all along. So why return? Because known places can still remain partially unknown. Because familiarity can hide unanswered questions. Because sacred sites, too, deserve renewed study. These are quieter motives than discovery, but perhaps more enduring ones. There were concerns by then about deterioration, about corrosion, about how the wreck was changing, about what future decades might bring. Survey was not mere curiosity. It was stewardship. To document is, in some sense, to care, and care too belongs to exploration. One of the remarkable things about Ballard's approach and related work in that era was the emphasis on seeing without violating, observation without intrusion, documentation without turning a grave into spectacle. This matters enormously at Arizona because every act of study there exists under ethical shadow. The dead remain inside. Knowledge cannot be pursued as though this were ordinary archaeology. Restraint is part of method, and perhaps Ballard understood that as well as anyone. His work around famous wrecks often carried a strong argument against treating them as treasure sites. Arizona made that argument unavoidable. No treasure here, only memory, only history, only the wreck. There is something quietly moving in imagining Ballard, whose career had brought him to immense depths, returning to a wreck lying in comparatively shallow water, a reminder that depth is not measured only in feet. Arizona is shallow, yet profound. Some places do not need abyssal darkness to be deep. They are deep in meaning, and perhaps this is what returns often reveal. Not simply new data, renewed perspective. Ballard returned not merely to a ship, but to a national wound-made material, to look again at something Americans thought they already knew, and perhaps discover that they did not fully know it After all, there were broader implications too. Work around Arizona helped strengthen the idea that modern war wrecks deserved treatment not merely as relics, but as submerged cultural heritage, a phrase that can sound academic until one realizes what it protects. Memory underwater, history underwater, graves underwater. To call such sites heritage is to insist they belong not to salvage opportunism, but to collective care. That idea has mattered far beyond Pearl Harbor, and perhaps that is part of Ballard's quieter legacy here. Not a spectacular discovery, a reinforcement of seriousness, of method, of reverence. Joined to technology, there is something almost monastic in that union. Machines serving silence, cameras serving memory, survey serving restraint. Late night history tends to notice such things because they do not announce themselves loudly. They deepen slowly. One can imagine a survey image resolving, steel contours appearing, forms of the wreck traced with new clarity, not replacing the human sense of standing at the memorial, but extending it below the surface, giving shape to what visitors only intuit, helping the unseen become, if not visible, more understood. And yet, even with better images, Arizona remained partly unknowable. That too matters. Technology did not exhaust mystery. It rarely does. It illuminated. It did not finish. Perhaps this section closes there with a return, not as conquest, but as listening. A scientist once known for finding lost ships, returning to a ship never lost, hovering, in effect, over a wreck already sacred, as if to say, even what we remember most deserves to be seen again. Mapping the wreck. There is a difference between seeing a wreck and mapping it. To see is to encounter. To map is to stay, to return, measure, compare, trace, and slowly build understanding from fragments. And for USS Arizona, mapping became one of the quietest and most important forms of remembrance, because memory alone can honor a wreck, but mapping can help protect it. And protection too is a form of honor. After divers, after direct observation, after renewed surveys associated with figures like Robert Ballard, attention increasingly turned toward a deeper question. How do you understand? A ship that cannot be fully entered, should not be fully disturbed, and is still changing with time. One answer was to map what could be known carefully, non-invasively, patiently. But perhaps mapping in this context is less like charting territory than listening to structure, because the wreck does not give itself all at once. It must be read, sometimes through sonar, sometimes through remote imaging, sometimes through repeated comparison over years, and perhaps most importantly, through humility about what remains uncertain. That humility matters, for maps often suggest mastery, as though once something is charted, it is possessed. But Arizona resists possession. The best maps here do not conquer mystery, they outline its edges. There is something beautiful in that. Sonar surveys helped reveal forms the eye alone could not easily hold together. Contours of hull, relationships between damaged sections, structural features obscured by water, silt, or perspective, things a diver might experience only partially could, through mapping, begin appearing in relation. And relation is what maps do best. They show not merely what exists, but how things belong together. And in a wreck shaped by explosion, that matters profoundly because destruction disorganizes. Mapping, in some quiet sense, restores legibility, not the ship itself, but our ability to understand its broken form. There is almost something restorative in that. Not restoration of steel, restoration of comprehension. Late night reflection lingers on such distinctions because they are subtle, and subtle things often carry depth. There were also photographic mosaics, images assembled into larger visual records, piece joined to piece like memory itself. One frame insufficient, many frames together, suggesting wholeness. And perhaps there is a quiet metaphor there too. No single witness holds all of history. Understanding comes mosaicked through accumulation, through joining partial views, through patience. Arizona has often required precisely that. Later technologies added further dimensions, digital modeling, three-dimensional representations, structural analysis, ways of seeing the wreck not available to earlier generations. And yet, strangely, the more precisely the wreck could be mapped, the more its fragility sometimes became evident. Knowledge increased, so did awareness of vulnerability. This too is often true. To know something better can make one realize how much can be lost. Mapping did not simply reveal Arizona, it revealed what was at stake in preserving her. There is also something almost philosophical in the idea of mapping a grave, because graves are usually marked, not mapped. Arizona is unusual in asking for both: commemoration above, documentation below, a memorial for the heart, a map for stewardship, and neither replaces the other. They belong together. Some surveys sought especially to monitor change, comparing past and present, watching for deterioration, tracking what slow collapse might mean materially. And here, mapping becomes almost a form of temporal listening, not merely where is the wreck, but how is it becoming different? Maps usually freeze space. These sought to observe time, and that is something rarer. A map, in effect, learning to notice aging. There is tenderness in that. Imagine measuring, not to dominate, but to care for what is growing old. That is what some of this work resembles. Care through measurement. A beautiful contradiction, perhaps, and perhaps not a contradiction at all. There were limits, naturally. No map fully captures atmosphere. No sonar image conveys the feeling of hovering beside corroded steel. No model contains silence. Maps reveal much, not everything, and it is important they do not pretend otherwise, because once again, Arizona teaches restraint. Even the best representation leaves something unrepresented. Perhaps it should, for some remainder of mystery belongs to reverence. There is another thought worth lingering on. Ancient mariners mapped coasts to avoid wreck. Modern researchers mapped a wreck to avoid losing memory. The purpose changed. The human impulse did not: to chart what matters, to preserve what could vanish. There is continuity in that, perhaps older than we realize. One can imagine a glowing survey screen in a darkened room, lines resolving into the shape of damaged hull, contours of a battleship appearing through data, researchers quiet around the image, no treasure being sought, no spectacle only attention, only the slow work of making the unseen more knowable. And perhaps this is where section 4.2 rests, not with dramatic discovery, but with the quieter revelation that even drawing the outline of a wreck can be an act of remembrance. For beneath the memorial, beneath the water, beneath the oil that still rises, the ship has been mapped, not so history may control it, but so history may keep faith with it. Survivors who came back. There is a kind of return harder to understand than divers returning to a wreck or researchers returning with instruments. It is when those who escaped a disaster return to the place where others did not as young men, as old ones, not in uniform for war, but in age, carrying memory. And perhaps few returns are more moving than those made by survivors of USS Arizona. Because what does it mean to go back to the ship that became your grave? Except you live? That question holds a depth history cannot easily measure. Many survivors did return, some once, some repeatedly, some privately, some for ceremonies, some bringing children or grandchildren, some coming not to speak much at all, only to stand, to look, to be near. And perhaps be near is the deepest phrase here, for proximity itself can matter when the dead remain below. You cannot visit shipmates in the ordinary way. There are no separate graves to tend. The wreck is the grave. So returning to the memorial became, for some survivors, the only form of visiting possible. That alone carries enormous emotional weight. In late-night reflection, one imagines an old man stepping onto the USS Arizona memorial, moving perhaps more slowly than he once ran across steel decks in fire, looking down at water, knowing exactly what lies below, not imagining, knowing. There is a difference. Visitors imagine the wreck. Survivors remember the ship before it was wrecked. They remember passageways intact, voices, faces, routine, laughter, perhaps. They carry two ships in mind at once, the living ship and the broken one below. That doubleness must be almost impossible to describe, perhaps only live with. Some survivors spoke publicly over the years of guilt, of grief, of loyalty, of things remembered vividly after decades. Others spoke less. Silence, too, can be testimony. History sometimes overvalues spoken memory and forgets the eloquence of those who simply return. Presence can witness. One does not need many words to stand above a grave. There is also something deeply human in how survivors often seemed to return, not chiefly for history, but for relationship, for friends lost, for shipmates. History can sound large and abstract. Shipmates is smaller, warmer, harder. It restores the scale of friendship. And perhaps that is essential, because disasters are often narrated in numbers. Survivors remember persons, and persons are what draw people back. Some described hearing names in memory while standing there. Some touched the memorial wall where names are inscribed. Some stared into water for long stretches. What occurs inwardly in such moments, no archive can fully record, and perhaps should not. Some things belong partly to privacy. Reverence sometimes means allowing interior life to remain interior. Still, even glimpses matter. They tell us return was not ceremonial alone. It was personal, sometimes profoundly so. There is another dimension almost impossible to overlook. Time itself. Men who survived as teenagers or young adults returned in their 70s, 80s, 90s. The arc is staggering. To live an entire lifetime after a morning when one might have died, to age while the dead remain forever young in memory. That temporal asymmetry can wound. Many who survive catastrophe know some form of it. Arizona made it literal. Survivors aged, shipmates below did not. And perhaps every return made that contrast palpable. Old hands above water, young names carved in stone. That is almost too much for thought. And yet, history asks us to sit beside such things. Late night history, especially because night makes room for what daylight often rushes past. Some survivors also participated in commemorations where ashes of former crew were later placed within the wreck. Those ceremonies, for those present, carried extraordinary significance, not simply memorial. Homecoming, a word one hesitates to use lightly. Yet, what else can it be when a man returns after death to the ship he left alive? There is almost Homeric gravity in that, ancient in feeling, and yet modern, American, naval, human. There were fewer survivors each year, then fewer still. History, which once lived in many voices, began passing into very few. That, too, changed the meaning of return. Each elderly survivor visiting the memorial came to embody a vanishing bridge, a person in whom 1941 still breathed directly. And when such people return to the wreck, it is not only individuals revisiting memory, history itself returning to its own origin. That is rare. There is perhaps no technology that equals that. No map, no sonar, no survey. An old sailor looking down into water may hold more history than instruments can gather, because he carries the ship before the bomb, before the fire, before the oil rose. Memory as living archive. And then, inevitably, those living archives diminish. This adds poignancy to every recorded return. Each one feels almost sacramental, a visitation, a keeping of faith. One can imagine a survivor leaning at the memorial rail at dusk, harbor light softening, visitors quiet around him. He says little, perhaps nothing, looks down, perhaps sees not the dark shape others strain to perceive, but a corridor once walked, a face once known, a Sunday morning not yet broken. And perhaps this is where section 4.3 ends, not with speeches, but with return itself, the simple, immense act of coming back to where part of one's life never left. Ashes returned to the ship. There are burials that close a life, and there are burials that seem, in some deeper sense, complete a bond. What happened at USS Arizona for some former crew belongs to the second kind, because over the years, a rare and deeply moving practice emerged. Some survivors of Arizona, after living out their lives, chose to have their cremated remains placed within the wreck, returned to the ship, returned to shipmates, returned as many saw it, home. Few customs in modern military memory carry such emotional force, because this is not symbolic scattering, not ashes released generally at sea. It is something far more specific. Ashes placed under careful procedures within the sunken battleship itself, inside the grave where comrades had remained since 1941. And perhaps there is something almost beyond ordinary language in that. For what does one call such an act? Burial, yes, but also reunion. There is no other word quite sufficient. The practice developed with solemn care. It was never casual, never a tourist ritual. It involved the Navy, families, divers, protocols, and above all, the recognition that Arizona is a war grave. Everything about such returns had to honor that, and largely it did. There is something deeply human in why some men made this choice. They had survived, married perhaps, worked, raised families, lived through decades. The dead aboard never received, and yet some part of identity remained tied to the ship, to that morning, to those lost beside them. So strong a tie that at life's end they wished not merely to be remembered as Arizona survivors, but to rejoin Arizona itself. That is extraordinary and profoundly difficult not to find moving. In late-night reflection, one senses ancient echoes here. Warriors returning to fallen companions. A last voyage, bones or ashes brought back among one's own. Though modern in method, the emotional structure feels old, perhaps timeless, because loyalty has ancient forms, and this is one of them. The ceremonies themselves were often quiet, intimate, sometimes attended by family, sometimes by former shipmates, if any remain. Divers carrying ashes down, a passage into the wreck, a placing within the ship, then ascent, surface light again, and above, those waiting. There is almost liturgy in that sequence. Descent, placement, return. No grand spectacle, only solemn action. And perhaps solemn action can speak more powerfully than words. Some of the men who chose this had said, in one form or another, they wanted to be with their shipmates. Such a simple sentence, yet how much it holds. With my shipmates, not with history, not in a monument, with persons, even after decades. Perhaps friendship, under enough pressure, does not obey time. Perhaps it keeps calling. Arizona seems to suggest so. There have been understandable discussions over the years about limits, who may be interred, under what conditions, how to honor both the dead of 1941 and the integrity of the site. These questions matter because reverence requires boundaries. Without boundaries, even beautiful customs can drift into sentiment or misuse. Arizona has largely resisted that through seriousness, and seriousness protects meaning. There is another dimension, quietly astonishing. Every such intimate altered the ship's story, not its original history, but its continuing history. The wreck did not only hold those lost in the attack. In rare instances, it received those who survived it. That makes Arizona not merely a preserved grave from the past, but, in a limited and sacred sense, a place where the past continued receiving the present. Few memorial sites can be spoken of that way. It gives the wreck a strange living continuity, not biological, not metaphorical, ritual continuity. And ritual, too, belongs to how humans keep faith with loss. Imagine the perspective of a family member to know a father or grandfather wished this, to watch ashes carried toward the ship where his youth nearly ended. To consent to such a burial is itself an act of understanding, perhaps even of sharing a bond one did not originally live. Memory passing generations through decision. There is beauty in that. Quiet beauty. Late night history often notices how some acts resist modern categories. This is one. It is military tradition, family mourning, maritime custom, sacred gesture, historical practice, all at once, too layered for one label, and perhaps the refusal of neat labeling is part of its depth. Deep things often exceed category. There is also, inevitably, the thought that each such intimate says something about survival itself. That survival is not always simple departure from trauma. Sometimes one leaves physically while part of oneself remains. And perhaps for some survivors, returning in ashes acknowledged that truth. Part of me never left. Now all of me returns. One hesitates to put words in the dead, yet one senses something like this. Perhaps this section closes with an image almost too still for narrative. Harbor water calm, a small ceremonial boat, family waiting, a diver descending below, the hull in green light, coral on steel, compartments dark, the dead long present. And now, one more shipmate returning. No applause, no proclamation, only water closing again above the wreck. And somewhere inside the old battleship, another reunion history almost never grants. Night at the memorial. There is a different Pearl Harbor after the last visitor leaves. In daylight, the harbor belongs partly to history, partly to movement. Boats arrive, voices carry, footsteps cross the white span of the USS Arizona Memorial. Guides speak, names are read, water flashes under sun. Even reverence in daylight exists alongside activity. But at night, the harbor changes, or perhaps more accurately, it reveals another layer, because some places do not merely become quieter in darkness, they become deeper, and the Arizona Memorial may be one of them. When evening settles over Oahu and the last colors fade from the sky, the white structure begins to look different, less architectural, more spectral, suspended over dark water. Its brightness softened under moonlight or harbor lamps, its shape so clear by day, now almost floating, and beneath it, the unseen hull of USS Arizona remains where it has remained for decades, only now hidden even more completely. Night gives concealment to what daylight at least suggests, and perhaps that concealment intensifies presence, because what cannot be seen often presses more strongly on thought. In late night reflection, this is where history often becomes intimate, not in the hours of explanation, but after, when facts have quieted, when only place remains. One imagines the memorial empty, no visitors, no spoken interpretation, only wind perhaps, water against structure, distant sounds from the harbor, and silence, not perfect silence. There is rarely such a thing, but the kind through which small sounds matter. A rope tapping a dock somewhere, a faint engine far off, water shifting under the memorial. Night makes one hear such things, and hearing them, one senses the harbor as living environment, not merely historic scene. That matters, because Arizona is not preserved in abstraction. It rests in real water, under real weather, through real nights. Night belongs to its story, perhaps more than many realize. For the attack itself came in morning violence, but memory often returns strongest in quiet, and night specializes in quiet. There is also something ancient about water at night. Harbors, after dark, have stirred human imagination for centuries. Departure, loss, waiting, ships unseen. Arizona, though no longer voyaging, still inhabits that older emotional geography. A ship in harbor, after dark, carries meanings daytime does not fully awaken, especially a sunken one. Some who have been near Pearl Harbor at night speak of an unusual stillness, not supernatural, simply atmospheric, a gravity, a sense the place gathers thought. And perhaps it does. Certain sights seem to ask inwardness. Night makes that asking harder to ignore. The memorial, so much a public place by day, can be imagined at night almost as vigil, not because anyone necessarily keeps formal watch, but because the structure itself seems watchful, standing over the dead, holding place, enduring darkness as it endures daylight. There is something deeply moving in that image, a memorial not closed by night, but continuing through it, keeping company, almost, with those below. One hesitates over such language, yet perhaps some poetic language is warranted here, because ordinary description can thin before places shaped by both beauty and grief. Moonlight on water has always invited poetry. Here it invites restraint as well. Imagine looking down from the memorial at night. If one could, the surface darker now, perhaps only slight reflections, no clear glimpse of wreck below, only black water holding what it holds. And perhaps this is when one feels most sharply that Arizona cannot be seen in any ordinary sense. It must be contemplated. Night encourages contemplation. Day often disperses it. There is another thought worth lingering on. At night, the names inscribed on the memorial would still be there, though perhaps harder to read. The dead do not vanish with visibility. Memory does not depend on sunlight. This seems obvious, yet there is quiet force in it. The memorial continues even when no one is looking. History does not require constant spectatorship to remain. Some truths keep vigil by themselves. Perhaps Arizona is one. And what of the oil that sometimes rises at night, perhaps unseen, yet perhaps still surfacing? That thought carries peculiar power even in darkness. Processes continue. The ship still ages. The sea still moves. Memory still rests. Nothing pauses because night has come. Rather, night lets one notice continuity. The harbor enduring hour after hour, decade after decade. There is a reason so much reflective history belongs naturally to nighttime. Night slows thought enough to feel duration. Arizona is a place of duration. Night reveals that. One can imagine the stars above Pearl Harbor, not the same stars sailors aboard Arizona saw before dawn in 1941, and yet, in another sense, continuous with them. Sky enduring over changed generation. A thought almost too large, yet strangely calming. The dead below, the stars above, the memorial between a vertical axis of memory. Perhaps this section closes there with the memorial at night, white against darkness, water moving softly beneath, no crowds, no speeches, only the long companionship of silence, steel, sea, and stars. What still sleeps in the hull? There are places within old wrecks where no diver goes or no longer goes. Places too collapsed, too fragile, too silted, too bound to the dead. And in USS Arizona, such places carry a particular gravity because what remains inaccessible is not merely physically unreachable. It is, in some sense, withheld, held back by damage, by time, by reverence. And perhaps that is why the question of what still sleeps in the hull feels larger than it sounds. For it is not only a question about objects hidden inside a wreck. It is a question about what history leaves unresolved. There are compartments within Arizona that have not yielded themselves fully to human knowledge. Some because structural collapse makes access unsafe. Some because disturbance would be inappropriate. Some because silt, corrosion, and the altered geometry of the ship have made certain spaces more silence than place. And silence, too, can be a kind of boundary. We often assume what exists should eventually be known. Arizona gently resists that assumption. There may be details of the ship that will remain only partly understood. And perhaps that is not failure. Perhaps it is fitting. In late-night reflection, inaccessible spaces carry almost disproportionate imaginative power, not because they invite fantasy, but because they remind us history is never exhausted. Even heavily studied sites retain unknown interiors, literal interiors. Here, the hull still contains more than has been fully seen. That matters because it keeps the wreck from becoming merely mastered knowledge. It remains, in part, mystery, and mystery can be a form of dignity. There is a temptation, when speaking of what sleeps in the hull, to imagine dramatic discoveries waiting, hidden artifacts, forgotten secrets. Such language belongs more to adventure than to Arizona. The deeper reality is quieter. What remains may be ordinary things, structural spaces, objects long altered beyond recognition, perhaps traces of shipboard life, perhaps only darkness and silt. And yet even only darkness and silt can carry enormous weight when it fills spaces where men died. Ordinariness does not lessen solemnity. Sometimes it deepens it, because history often lives in ordinary remnants, a locker, a tool, a fragment, where no one has looked in generations. Not treasure, presence, and perhaps presence is the better word for what still sleeps in the hull. Not things, presence, the presence of what remains unentered, unresolved, untouched. There is also the dead themselves. Some compartments are inseparable from the fact that human remains may be associated with them. This changes everything. Curiosity meets moral limit, and should. Not every unknown is an invitation to uncover. Some unknowns are invitations to restraint. Arizona may teach that more clearly than many places, for modern culture often confuses access with right. Arizona says otherwise. Some doors may remain closed, even when the doors are broken steel. Especially then, there is something almost monastic in accepting that, to let part of a place remain silent not because one lacks tools, but because silence itself may be appropriate. Late-night history tends to honor such appropriateness because night has patience for what remains unsolved. Day often rushes to answer. Night can sit beside questions. What still sleeps in the hull? Some answers exist. Many perhaps do not. And perhaps the question matters, partly because it remains a question. There is another layer. Memory itself sleeps in ways not unlike wreck interiors. Some things remain accessible, others recede, others are present but unreachable, except by hints. Human remembrance has its own sealed compartments. Perhaps we respond to inaccessible spaces in wrecks because they mirror something inward. The parts of history we cannot fully reopen, the parts of ourselves we cannot either. Arizona, once again, seems to widen beyond naval history into something more human. That is part of its power. One can imagine a diver stopping at the threshold of a passage too unstable to enter, light reaching only a little way. Beyond it, darkness thick with suspended particles, nothing visible, yet not emptiness, a boundary. The diver turns back, not defeated, respectful. There is meaning in turning back, perhaps more than modern instincts easily admit. To stop can be wisdom, to refrain can be honor. Researchers too live with this. All scholarship has edges beyond which evidence thins. Arizona simply makes those edges physical. Steel edges, silt edges, ethical edges, and perhaps because they are so tangible, they are easier to contemplate. Where does knowledge end? Sometimes at a collapsed compartment, sometimes at reverence, sometimes both. There is something almost beautiful in that convergence. One might say the hull still sleeps because not everything within it has been awakened into explanation, and perhaps not everything should be. Sleep, after all, can imply rest, and rest may be the most fitting word of all for parts of Arizona left undisturbed. Perhaps this section closes there, not with revelation, but with a threshold, a beam of light fading into a passage no one enters. Water still, silt drifting, the old ship holding its interior silences, and somewhere within those untraveled spaces, history sleeping still. A battleship becoming a reef, a grave, a memory. There are some places history refuses to remain one thing. They gather meanings instead, layer upon layer, until no single word can contain them. USS Arizona has become such a place. To call it only a battleship is true, but incomplete. To call it only a grave is true, but incomplete. To call it only a memorial or only a reef is likewise insufficient. Arizona has become all of these, and perhaps the deepest late-night question is not which meaning is correct, but how one place can hold so many at once. A battleship becoming a reef, a grave, a memory. That phrase may sound poetic, yet it is also literal. The ship was a battleship. It is a grave. Marine life has made it, in part, a reef, and it lives in collective consciousness as memory. Four realities, not successive exactly, overlapping, coexisting, and perhaps this overlapping is what makes Arizona feel almost larger than ordinary history. Because ordinary categories begin failing, it exceeds them. In late-night reflection, there is something almost philosophical in watching an object built for war become habitat, a machine built to project force becoming shelter for fish, armor plate bearing coral, guns resting amid living marine motion. One could call that irony, but perhaps it is more than irony. Perhaps it is transformation beyond human intention. The builders did not plan this. The dead did not choose it. The sea did it, and time together. Yet, even as Reef Arizona remains grave, this is crucial. Life has not erased death. Marine growth has not softened the solemnity of those still inside. One must resist the temptation to let reef romanticize what remains fundamentally a war tomb, and yet one must also resist ignoring the living systems present. Truth here lies in holding both. The grave lives within a reef. The reef grows upon a grave. That is uncomfortable, and perhaps precisely for that reason, honest history is often uncomfortable where it is most true. Then there is memory. Memory is perhaps the strangest layer, because unlike steel or coral, memory does not reside physically in the wreck alone. It lives in people, in stories, in ceremonies, in school books, in silence at the memorial, in descendants who never saw the attack. Memory is not in the ship the way coral is in the ship. Yet somehow memory has become inseparable from the ship, so that Arizona now exists materially underwater and symbolically in minds. Two modes of existence joined. Few historical sites embody that as vividly. Some are remembered but gone. Some remain but are little remembered. Arizona remains and is remembered intensely. That conjunction gives it unusual power. There is perhaps an even larger thought. Battleships were once designed as instruments of national will, expressions of industrial might, strategic presence. Arizona was built for a geopolitical order that has long since changed, and yet in becoming reef, grave, and memory, the ship has acquired meanings, arguably deeper than its original military purpose. Its afterlife may matter more than its intended life. That is extraordinary. Imagine building something for war and history, making it instead a place of mourning, ecology, and reflection. History sometimes revises the meaning of what humans make. Arizona may be one of its clearest examples. Late-night history notices such revisions because they unfold slowly enough to be missed in louder narratives. There is also humility in this becoming. A battleship once represented control, yet its final meanings emerged largely through forces beyond control. Attack, sinking, corrosion, marine colonization, collective remembrance. No admiral designed these. No engineer planned them. And yet, they became the ship's enduring identity. Perhaps some of history's deepest meanings are precisely those no one intended. This can be strangely consoling or unsettling. Perhaps both. One can imagine looking at Arizona through each layer in turn. As battleship, see guns, armor, naval ambition. As grave, see the dead within. As reef, see coral, fish, living water. As memory, see visitors standing in silence above. Four visions, same place, and perhaps wisdom lies not choosing among them, but holding them together. The mind resists such complexity. It prefers singular definitions. Arizona asks more. It asks layered attention, and layered attention is close to reverence, because reverence often means refusing to reduce. There is another quiet truth. All four layers continue changing. The wreck ages. The grave receives new generations of remembrance. The reef evolves. Memory itself shifts as living witnesses disappear. Arizona is not finished becoming. Even now, that may be the most haunting thought of all. History there is not closed. It continues, not through new explosions, through slow metamorphosis, a rare thing for a battlefield. Perhaps this section closes with an image wide enough to hold these layers. Below, a warship steel dark underwater. Within, the dead. Upon it, coral growing. Above, the memorial. And in the mind of one standing there, memory, all present, all real. A battleship becoming a reef, a grave, a memory, and still becoming. The last oil on the water. There is a way some stories do not end with an event, not with the bomb, not with the explosion, not even with the sinking. They end with an image that gathers everything before it into stillness. For USS Arizona, perhaps that image is oil on water, not the burning oil of December 7th, 1941, not fire spreading across a harbor under attack, but the small, dark trace that still rises, the thin sheen, the black bead surfacing, the last oil on the water. And perhaps last is not literal, for no one can say which droplet will be the last. Perhaps none alive will see it. Perhaps the wreck will release traces for years beyond us. But last belongs here in another sense, as a final image, a closing emblem, the thing left shimmering when the story grows quiet. In late night reflection, it feels almost inevitable to end here, because oil has accompanied this story from fire to memory. It burned in catastrophe. It drifted through aftermath. It rose through decades, and now it returns as ending a circle completed. There is something almost liturgical in such return. History rarely offers such symbols so naturally. Usually we impose them. Here, the wreck itself provides one. That matters because it keeps the ending honest. The oil is not invented meaning. It is there, a real phenomenon. Yet also more than phenomenon, it has become, for many, a way of thinking about what endures. And endurance may be the deepest theme of Arizona. The dead endure in memory. The wreck endures in water. The memorial endures above. And even oil endures, surfacing in small, dark witnesses. Witnesses. Perhaps that is the right word. Each droplet a witness from below, silent, material, unarguing, simply appearing, then spreading thin into light. There is extraordinary quiet power in that. Some endings seek grandeur. This one seeks almost the opposite. Smallness, a tiny dark bloom on harbor water. Because sometimes small things carry what large events cannot continue carrying. The bomb cannot keep exploding. Fire cannot keep burning forever. But a droplet can rise again and say enough. There is also something profoundly maritime in ending with surface and depth joined. Oil comes from below to above, from hidden wreck to visible water, from interior darkness to open light. It crosses layers, and much of this whole story has been about such crossings. Past into present, grave into memorial, steel into reef, silence into memory. Oil belongs naturally among them. It is another crossing, perhaps the last one we need. Late night history often ends best where thought can keep moving after words stop. Oil on water allows that because it is unfinished by nature. The sheen drifts, breaks apart, disappears. Then perhaps later, another appears. The image itself resists final closure, and perhaps true endings often do. They leave a little open water, a little room. There is another thought. One day, perhaps far beyond our knowing, the oil may cease, the trapped fuel exhausted, the wreck altered, the droplets no longer rising. If that day comes, what then? Perhaps nothing essential changes, for by then the oil will have done what symbols do. It will have taught people how to see the wreck. Even absence can preserve what presence once revealed, and perhaps that too is comforting. That meaning need not vanish when phenomena do. Still, tonight, we imagine it still rising, because it does. A final dark bead reaching the harbor surface. Moonlight, perhaps, touching its thin sheen. No crowds watching, no ceremony, only water receiving what the wreck releases. And perhaps, somewhere nearby, the memorial, white in darkness, the ship below, the dead within, the reef growing, the slow collapse continuing. All the layers of this story held in one small surface trace. It is hard to imagine a quieter ending, and perhaps quiet is right, for late night history does not end by closing doors. It lets the room darken, lets thought settle, lets silence do the last work. So let it end there, at the water, at the sheen, at the black tear widening softly in moonlight, the last oil on the water, and beneath it, the old battleship, still at anchor,